I am thrilled to have Nicolette of Mamas Roots are showing on the podcast again. You were first introduced to her in the second episode, When Did You Know? Today, however, we cover a lot more ground. Growing up as a fourth-generation farming family, being close to the land is second nature to Nicolette. So naturally, we talk about farming and gardening, our own connections to nature, and raising children outdoors. We also talk about what it means to be a peaceful parent, the importance of addressing our own triggers and childhood wounds so we can be more mindful in how we interact with our kids, and so much more. Grab yourself a nourishing drink, kick off your shoes, and settle in. Here's my conversation with Nicolette.
Well, my name is Nicolette, and I have a blog and a podcast called Mamas Roots are Showing. And in it, I explore motherhood. So all sorts of things, whether it's peaceful parenting, whether it's self-care, whether it's keeping your family healthy by eating healthy foods or taking a look at your water. It really explores all the nooks and crannies of motherhood. And so I do that because I myself am a mom and I'm so interested in the journey of motherhood. I have 3 kiddos. I have a 7-year-old, a 4, almost 5-year-old. He'll be 5 on Friday, and a little one who's 1.5. I have 2 boys and a little girl, and a German Shepherd person named Kane, who has been with us. He'll be 12 in May. I have been married to my husband for, I got to think about this. I don't know how many years now, which I know sounds silly, but I don't. And that's because I've known him since I was in kindergarten. So we met when we were 5. Yeah. So the years go by,
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, that's amazing.
yes, it is. So we have a true friendship, which is really cool. And we have so many memories of when we were growing up together because we both went to a very small town school. And I think there was, 20 kids in our kindergarten class. And by the time we graduated, there was 26 or something. So
Oh my goodness. So that was the same children
pretty
pretty
much,
much
I
from
mean,
kindergarten to 12th
yeah.
grade?
So there was a few that came in and, came in and out, but I think I'd have to look at our pictures in our yearbook, but it's something like 15, 16 of them were all original.
Wow, that sounds so Norman Rockwell-ish.
It really is. It's a very small town. And I am a fourth generation farm girl from this town.
Mm.
So both sides of my family came here and farmed. And so that's a heritage that I'm really proud of. So my family's been here for a long time. My husband's family moved here when he was very little. So that's why I
Okay.
grabbed him.
Yeah, you're like, "You're new. Come on. You're coming with me."
There's no relations here. Yeah.
That's funny. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So being that you have 4 generations of families that are farming, I imagine that has impacted the way that you see parenthood and motherhood and raising children naturally as possible and as close to the earth as possible. So can you speak a little bit about how that has impacted your thought process as becoming a mom and then what that looks like kind of day to day?
1,000%. It has impacted me probably in more ways that I realize now, of course, than I ever realized before. Um, I had a lot of freedom because I had this open space to explore as a child. And interestingly enough, I was just talking about this the other day because I had a lot of time to just be by myself and be outside. And I didn't have, to stay in an enclosed yard or um, I never felt like I was never in my room. I was only in my room to sleep. I was
Mm.
constantly outside and because I was able to do that, I was able to really get to know myself. And I think that's a beautiful gift, that time alone, being bored, being by yourself. I had this luxury of knowing who I was at a very young age and being comfortable with that. um, and being able to explore different parts of myself. I was able to sing at the top of my lungs and not care if anybody heard me. I was able to act out different plays that I wrote and not care if somebody saw me doing something goofy in my backyard. So that was really cool. And also,
Hmm.
my dad was a farmer. by, that's what he did for a living. And so we definitely had a connection to the seasons, the rhythm of nature.
That's a
And
good point.
yeah, so it was always, let's go look at the stars, and let's look at the soil. Oh, let me take you for a walk out to the field. Oh, the peas are starting to grow here. This one's
Yeah.
germinating. So it really, the outdoors feels like home for me. I think that I was just very close to nature because I saw it in my backyard so closely,
Hmm.
and because our lives were impacted with harvest and with planting season. So the seasons, the rhythms of nature were such a huge part of my life. And it is something that I have, I hope to pass on to my children, and I'm working at doing. So we spend a lot of time outside and looking at bugs and looking at how things change in the
Hmm.
seasons and such. So it has influenced my journey as a parent in probably the largest way than anything else.
Yeah. And when you were mentioning being outside a lot as a child and playing in your or playing and learning about yourself and really getting to know who you are, it made me think of
Mhm.
my childhood, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s. So I loved being outside, and I would stay out all day long, wait until the lightning bugs came. We would play tag with the neighborhood kids into the evening. And just recently we were discussing the fact that in the summertime, or in the evening, especially in the spring, in the summer, the bugs would be so significant if you were driving in a country road that your windshield would just be basically just disgusting with bugs. And how now we don't see that. And I'm wondering if that's something that's happening for you all where you live. Do you notice, because you are kind of a little further out away from city life? Do you notice that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, actually, I've had that exact conversation with people before too. Yeah, we live in a definitely a mono agricultural society where I live, where it's everybody grows one or two things, and so yeah, I've seen things really shift here. I wanted to get bees, and a few years ago, I reached out to some sort of an organization that are experts on bees, and they asked me where I lived. And when I told them, they said, "Well, can you move?
Oh my gosh.
Because the odds are against you to raise bees where you're at." Now, people do it, I guess what you might call successfully here. But when you're surrounded by
Hmm.
fields that are being sprayed with pesticides and herbicides, it really has a detrimental impact on the bee population. And I have had uh, people who I know that have bees lose all their bees before.
Mm, mm. Yeah.
So it's a challenge. I mean, we try to grow everything. I live on a small plot. I have 8.5 acres. It's nothing huge. Um, and we're surrounded by those fields, and so that's another thing with my kids. I have to tell them, we got to play over here. You can't go too far, right?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And we ran into that too. We had some friends that lived more in the country, and we spent a lot of time with them throughout the younger homeschooling years. And same thing, she had a field behind her, and the neighbor, she said, "Well, we know when they spray." And, she was like, "We're just kind of not going to play out in the back right now," which was
Yep.
terrible because it was such a beautiful space and so large and lovely and open and wide. But it was sort of like a very defined line where you kind of was like, not to say that it's not going to getting the air or even the water and rush into their yard potentially, but just to have to be aware of that part of the farming and agriculture and that side of the world, um, definitely makes you appreciate the backyard gardening opportunities and
Yes, it
really
does.
understanding where your food comes from. So, do you have a garden? Do you all have like backyard gardens? And 8 acres, by the way, sounds like paradise to me because I'm on like less than one.
Well, it's no, it's a really beautiful piece of property. We do have a creek that runs next to us too, so we spend quite a bit of time, as much as we can, out there just going for little adventures, which is really cool. There's always opportunities to see wildlife down there, and
Mm,
I don't know anybody that doesn't love running water.
I know.
Yeah. It's
It's
very
it's a
primitive,
treat.
right? Yep.
It is, yes, and my kids love it. My eldest, I remember being out there, this was probably 2 years ago, and he just sat down, he would just stare at it and just watch the creek move, and I remember him looking
Mm,
up at me and just saying, "Oh, don't you just love the sound of it, mom?" And it was so
mhm.
pure, and, I was so happy that he noticed that.
Yes,
So,
yes. It's
yeah, so
wonderful.
it is, and we do have a big garden. We have what a lot of people would call, and this is the first time that we did it because we've rented this property, but we bought it this past year, and so I finally put. I was like, okay, now I can really do what I want with the garden because it's ours now. So we have sort of what's called a potager style
I'm not
garden.
familiar with that.
So it's a French term, and what it because before I would just kind of grow stuff. Well, now I want it to be this very inspiring and beautiful space where I go to. So I have, beautiful trellises, and I use a lot of flowers and vegetables and things like that. So it's just a way to sort of beautify the space a little bit so that it adds a little inspiration when you're out there.
Yeah, so it's not just functional and growing food, it's also a space to actually inhabit and beautify, like you said, with the flowers, and you can interact with it a little differently. I can imagine it would be an area that kind of calls you to it to cut flowers or even just smell and see the bees flying around and the bugs, and that sounds really, really lovely. So is it marked off? Like, do you have a is it marked off like with a gate or a perimeter, or is it sort of like a free flowing space?
So we are in the process of kind of putting um I want to have like some sort of a stone wall to kind of have it be separate.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad, interestingly enough, he passed away well, 3 years ago, but he farmed the field on the other side of the creek. And so on the
Mm.
other side of the creek, there's all these stones that he and rocks that he picked from the field, and
Oh,
so we were able to my husband just went over there, grabbed, a ton of the stones with, I don't even know what piece of machinery he used, and then brought them over to our garden.
wow.
And so we've been able to use these rocks that my dad picked with his hands, over the course of, I don't even know, 20, 30 years that he's been running that farm. And so they're actually in my garden now. So I have stone walls and we have raised garden beds that are out of stone. We've also cut down a lot of some of the trees that are more of the junk trees that are on our creek line. And then
Mm-hmm.
my husband built me a beautiful arbor out of trees. And so we now have that too. So there is sort of, there's some delineation, but it's definitely open where you can still see it. And it's
Yeah.
lovely. I love gardening. It is, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure. Do you garden too, Missy?
Well, so I we did, yes, and we have raised beds. And when the kids were younger, it was absolutely a priority of mine to ensure that they saw plants grow from seed to harvest. And then I certainly got them involved with picking things out and what their favorite foods were that we could grow in the garden. So over the years, it slowly got less and less just as they got older and their interest in it sort of waned. And even, my time itself was pulled a little bit more, and I just kept it to the bare minimum. So like tomatoes and cucumbers.
Yeah.
And then in this past year, actually, we really hardly did anything. And then I told the kids, I was like, we have to get back into it this year. And we did try one year, we tried to grow corn, we tried to grow watermelon and cantaloupe, and then realized that those are definitely larger space crops, and there's only so much space you can utilize in the raised beds. So we're keeping it to the smaller crops and things like we're going to probably add beans this year and snap peas. And we've got lettuce for sure and spinach. I used to even have the pots that can move around the yard, and we would just move them to the sunlight and throw stuff in them.
Oh, yeah.
So even it might not have been like as pretty, but it was functional. Um, and then, so yeah, no, gardening has been something we've definitely done for many, many years. And I've even incorporated some of our neighborhood kids. There were one family that moved on our street. It's been years now. And he had never seen anything grown. And he was so adorable when he came over one day and I said, it's time to pick the carrots. Would you like to help? And he's like, sure. and he starts picking them all. I was like, wait, 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 wait. Like there's, you just do a couple. And then I have this picture I'll never, I mean, this picture will be something that we cherish for a long, long time, but he had this huge grin on his face and this handful of like baby carrots that were nowhere near being ready. But we were like, you know what, that's an amazing experience for him. And that's okay. We're going to lose a few carrots for his ability to have that experience. So um, that has been fun for me to share that with other kids. And then in our homeschool community, one of our families has a lot more property, and this was probably, I mean, think because Sadie was probably like a year and a half, 2 years old, so it's been 12 years now, and we had like 20 something families come together and do a large community garden, and it
Wow.
was so gratifying. It got to the point where we even had the local news come and interview my
Ah,
friend and had the kids in there and they were picking watermelon and chopping it up and eating it on the news, you know, just to show the idea of community and pulling together your resources and teamwork and many hands make light work kind of thing. And it was a really good experience. So I would love to do that again.
yeah, it's really wonderful. I mean, I guess growing up on a farm, I kind of it was something that was just I was born into, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it is amazing to think that there's people who, yeah, they've never grown something before. So this whole process, something growing, planting a seed is completely foreign to them. So I can just picture that little guy just
Mm-hmm.
picking everything because there is something very satisfying in pulling something out of the earth. And here it
Yeah.
is. So I'm sure he just got a little carried
Yeah.
away.
He probably did. Yes, he did.
That's
It
right.
was great. So, as far as like the children being in nature, and do you all have like a group of people that you get together with fairly regularly? Now that I don't even know if we mentioned this, but you are homeschooling.
Yes, yes. I'm a homeschool mama.
Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how that evolved and how that looks for your family now with your kids being the ages that they are?
Sure. So, as I mentioned before, I have a 7 year old, an almost 5 year old, and a 1.5 year old. So, we are certainly new to the homeschooling world, but it is something that I decided I wanted to do. Actually, before my eldest was at school age, I just kind of began questioning a lot of a lot of things. And that started, as a younger age. It started off with
Mm-hmm.
food, really, which you and I discussed about questioning food and where it came from to bring it back
Mm,
to the gardening and to bring it back to the farm world. I started looking at why does the FDA approve of this, but not this? And um, why are they telling us to eat this, but not this? And so I just began questioning the status quo and not accepting what mainstream things were and actually examining why things were the way that they were. And when I became pregnant, that was the same thing. I wanted to know, well, why do we birth this way? Why do we
mm,
why do
mm-hmm.
we put babies in a crib? And so, and again, this isn't to say that there's one way of doing something and everybody should do it, but I think there's a lot more options out there that are available to people. And so I just started researching a lot of these things. And because I went to college to be an educator, when it was time for me to at least begin thinking about school for my eldest, I had enough courage, I had enough confidence to look into
Mm-hmm.
homeschooling because of my education background. But I very quickly realized that that wasn't necessary
Yeah.
at all. And of course, I'm still gathering information on homeschooling every day. And I'm sure that our journey is going to evolve and change from day to day, from year to year. But there are some things that I think are very important. And one of them is a sense of community, like you mentioned. And so 2 years ago, at the start of COVID, I actually started a wild and free group.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, so that's a international homeschooling community, and they have local groups
Mm-hmm.
that are,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the name's very fitting, wild and free. And so then COVID hit literally a week after I started the group or something. So we had that up against us, but we ended up getting to know each other on social media a lot
Mm-hmm.
because of the things that we had scheduled obviously were canceled. And these were people that I didn't know. I knew two ladies that I had like met in another homeschooling group, but I had only met them once. So it was very new. Long story short, we created a lot of momentum on social media and we then agreed, okay, this is enough. We're getting the kids together. And so we've been,
Yeah. Well, and
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to throw in that in that specific example, that shows the beauty of being able to communicate through social media because you're able to plan and bounce ideas off each other and kind of figure out who likes what, and then you can put it into place. So it sounds like y'all were able to do that piece of it with, even though you were up against the COVID restrictions at the time.
Yeah, we were. And, we have a, gosh, I love our group so much. It just breathes life into each and every one of us. We had to go
Mm.
through a weeding out process because we really had to define what we wanted for our group. And so,
Mm-hmm.
because it was, essentially my group, I got to pick what our
Mm-hmm.
guidelines were and such. And there were some people that, had to make their exit because it didn't jive. And I'm so glad that we went through that process because we could have had, 200 members, but it wouldn't have been this core group that it is now. And
Mm-hmm.
so we meet every Friday, and then we also do a mama's night out or mama's day out, whatever it might be, where we might do yoga together and just hang out and have these conversations that moms so need to have. And then we do other things, if there's a cool event that's happening, we'll schedule that too. But basically, it's just us meeting, going outside to different parks and different nature areas and hanging out. And it's really lovely.
You said you meet every week, every Friday, but is there like a set activity that you're trying to do each week?
Um, it's really open ended. So and what I like is that we usually ask maybe one or two. We like to pair them up and to have two moms work together to plan each month. So they have to come up with where we're
Mm-hmm.
going, what we're doing, which is cool because they may have been to a place that some of us have never been to. If it was only me, I started the group, if it was only me and I was doing all the planning, it would be limited because there's many places that we've gone to that I had never even heard of before. So it's really nice to share the responsibilities of that, and it also gives the group ownership.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I know this, and I also have a lady that I asked to be sort of the administrator or leader of the group with me, and it's really nice to have that because this past weekend I was out of town and she was, getting back to people and handling it. So it's nice to have to partner up.
It absolutely is. Yeah, for sure. And I've helped with several co-ops and multiple groups over the course of the last, 12 years or so. And what I have found to be the case, and I could completely relate to what you were saying about sort of weeding the group out. And it's not a matter of being exclusive, it's more about creating the group that works for the people who want to be in it.
Hmm.
And I have seen with the larger the group gets, the more schooly it gets. And that's the last thing I wanted to have, is to replicate the school situation in our homeschool world. And we had to back out of a group at one point because it got so big and it became to the point where even parents were like, we need a list of rules to put on the wall. And I was like, no, we don't.
Mm-mm.
Nope, not doing that. Or we need somebody to take attendance, or we need this. And I was just like, okay, whoo, this is nope. And even though I was allowing my kids to make the decision as far as was this working for you or not, it's interesting how they started feeling it too. I noticed that bigger groups got, the more it sort of leaned towards this need to become more structured and more rigid almost. We found that the smaller activities, smaller groups were a little bit more in line with kind of the way we wanted to do things as well. And it also made it easier to go places because if you have 75 people, it's kind of hard to show up at a park with 75 kids and parents. And um, so over the years, we've definitely had that experience too. And I will say, like, I named our school Nature's Path Academy because we wanted to be outside. And
Oh, yeah.
I knew that from the minute we'd made this decision that outside was our classroom. And I wanted to take advantage of
Mm-hmm.
all the possible activities that we could. So we have very much adventured all throughout our city and all throughout the areas outside of our city. And we used to take day trips constantly, which what is the beauty of our schedule is because we don't really have that time frame. It's not like you have to be back at a certain time. And so we would get up in the mornings and coordinate with other families. And sometimes we'd leave at like 8 and we'd be gone until, dinner time. And those are some of my most favorite memories, most favorite, being outside all day long.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And the outdoors can build such skills and such
Mhm.
relationships. Another reason that we kept the group small was because we really wanted to create this sense of a village. We want our kids to have these friendships. And when you have a huge group, you might see some people here and there, but I'm a member of a couple of these larger homeschooling groups that are basically online, and someone will
Mhm.
post an event and you have no idea who's coming up, and those all have or who's going to be there. um, you don't
Yeah.
really know them. And so this was something that, with a lot of intention, I wanted to create something that was really going to take us through the years of homeschooling and provide those connections and those friendships and those relationships for
Mhm.
me and for my kids. And so we set out to create some guidelines. We do have a very loose sort of attendance policy, and that's for a couple different reasons. Obviously, one is that we do want people to show up because that's how you build that sense of community and build those relationships. But
Yeah, and to take it seriously and ownership
yes,
to it for sure. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. But it's also we do all of our communicating on Facebook, and we had a lot of people, and of course we were understanding during COVID when that struck, but we had a lot of people who had joined and never came to an event. Well, we're posting
Mm.
where we're meeting and when we're meeting. And so we just put a rule in, I think it was last week, that we said, you know what, you have 6 weeks from the day, everybody has 6 weeks, no matter how long you've been with us. But moving forward, it went from the day that you join, you have 6 weeks to attend a meeting. And if you don't, then we're going to have to remove you for the safety of our family.
Mhm.
We're posting pictures of our children and such. So
Mhm.
we've had to evolve, and we've had to make some guidelines and some rules. It's certainly a learning experience, but it's been great. And basically we just go together and go for hikes outside. We explore different places. Then we have some places that are very special to us that we visit a lot, and we've done different events. My kids weren't able to go, but I know there was an event, like a STEM event at the roller skating rink, where we had a whole, obviously we got to do a free skate, but they talked about friction, and they got to build a roller skate.
Oh, that's
Um,
cool.
yeah, we've gone on nature walks where we had a guide and they showed us different seeds and such during the fall. So there's different things that we do, but the majority of the time it's just us going and hanging out.
Mhm.
And that's been probably my favorite outing that we've had to date. We went to this place I had never been to, and the kids ended up finding basically an entire carcass of a dead deer.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it was just bones, I should say. It was just bones. And so they were all collecting bones and bringing them home and stuffing them in their backpacks. Um, it was hilarious, and
I
we were
know.
all just saying only homeschool
I
kids,
know.
right?
Oh, yeah.
And so oh my gosh, I mean, literally every child went home with, at least 10 bones that
Mhm.
day. And then they were also, they just started constructing and building this little meeting space with, they were moving logs together. And I was like, this is what childhood should be about. They were just
Mhm.
being industrious and working together. It was an absolutely beautiful day, and it just solidifies for you your decision to homeschool when things like that
Mhm.
happen, because you can question, not that I question homeschooling, but sometimes I definitely will have weak moments where you question yourself, like, am, am I doing the right things? Am I doing enough?
Mhm.
And when you have just days like that, it's usually not after your child, oh yeah, he did everything I asked him to do today, and we check this off, and he read this much, that's great. But it's those moments that are unexpected where, yeah, you just discover bones in a
Mm-hmm.
forest
Mm-hmm.
and the children are moving logs that are really inspiring. You go, this is what life is
It
about.
sure is.
This is what we should be learning it like.
Well, and it teaches that the importance of coming together for a common goal and how each child can utilize the strengths that they have. And it's fascinating to find out how fast other children will be like, hey, so and so, you to go do this, or hey, you did this, or somebody will take the lead. And then you have others who will kind of, they'll switch it up. And I've just found over and over and over again, if ever there is energy that's getting too cranked up inside, it's like, let's take it outside. Let's go to nature
Oh,
because you can just diffuse all that energy. And always it felt as if when we met our families and friends out somewhere, that those are the days that we remember. We don't remember the really calculated, organized, possible indoor events. Not to say that some of those weren't wonderful and beautiful too, but it's almost like the free flowing days of just sort of playing and randomly meeting other people, not randomly meeting other people, and the kids randomly creating like a fort in the woods with no intention set ahead of time. It was more or less our intention was to meet you and then go play. And
yes.
yeah, there's so many, like I'm just sitting here, my brain's kind of like reliving all these thoughts and memories of places that we just go to all the time. And even still, like I think because of our years of spending as much time as we could outside, my oldest, who's 19, oh my gosh, that's so crazy to me. He's talking about how he wants to do some sort of a summer trip somewhere where he can either be like a counselor or a ranger or something outdoors out west. And he's just like, Mom, I just love being outside, and I just think that would be such a great experience. And I was like, I agree. So we're in the market for figuring something like that out now.
Oh, I love that. That's one thing that as a mom, I want my kids to have a relationship with nature because
Mm-hmm.
not only do they want them to respect nature so that they can make good choices for Earth, but also there can be so much comfort brought
For
by
sure.
being in nature and this connection to something bigger than yourself. We all feel better going out for a walk. And I want my
Mm-hmm.
kids to understand that and to use it as a tool when they face something that might be troubling or challenging in their lives. I want them to be able to turn to nature for comfort and to kind of have it recenter them.
For sure. Well, and I have seen it, I've seen it humbles you. It,
Hmm.
is all inspiring. It's fascinating. And there's nothing like it. There's nothing you can do on any television or TV or screen that will give you the same feeling as going outside and exploring the world around you. And I say that even from when my kids were little, like from itty bitty babies looking in the grass and finding bugs and turning over a rock and seeing a worm. And those are like those moments build and build and build to the point where now, my son's like, now I'm ready to just go into the world and be somewhere for months at a time. And I think it helps our children get to know themselves on a deeper level too, because then they can figure out what their strengths are, maybe what their risk, are they risk averse? Are they pushing their boundaries a little bit? What makes them feel most safe? What makes them feel most uncomfortable? And, sometimes when we go on hikes together, I sort of had to get to a point where I have to stand back a little further now because they'll be like right there on the edge of those rocks. I'm like, okay, my goodness. But you can't be like, oh, watch out, watch out, watch out, because and they probably would. It's almost as if the idea of trying to make them be so safe does the opposite, because then they're not trusting themselves anymore. They hear your voice telling them to be careful constantly. And it's not like I'm asking or telling my kids to just go randomly run without thinking things through. Like, be thoughtful about what you're about to do, but it's important for them to have those adventures and take those risks.
Oh,
And
yeah, I
it really
agree.
does
You know,
strengthen them.
it does. And, when we look at, I think you actually posted something about this, and I just finished the book yesterday, Free to Learn by Peter Gray.
Oh yeah, that's a wonderful one.
It's a wonderful book, and I've read a few other ones that to kind of talk about how in other um, in other cultures how there's more free reign with
Mm-hmm.
children, and certainly in years long ago there was more free reign that children had. And what when you are constantly telling your child what to do and and showing them you need to assess this risk, be careful, they end up not getting to know what their own boundaries should be because you're telling them what it is, when actually kids, even at a very young age, they're pretty good at assessing what's dangerous for them
Mm-hmm.
and figuring it out. We need to trust them more, and nothing provides those opportunities more than just being outside, crossing that log, walking on those rocks, climbing that tree. That's the best way to do it. And like you said, this is a way that kids get to know themselves. And that's so important. It's so, I mean, being outside, not only is it wonderful for your mental health, and um, I'm sure you've read this book and are familiar with it, Last Child in the Woods.
Oh yes, forever ago. Loved it. I actually got to hear him speak when he came to Charlotte. It was
Oh,
wonderful. Mm-hmm.
yeah, genius. And it talks about how there's so much mental illness, um, and how we've seen such a decline in children being outside and the negative impact that that has on children. And that
Mm-hmm.
was definitely one of the reasons why we chose to homeschool, because I wanted my kids to have this relationship with the outdoors, because through that, you end up having a relationship with yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, you know, when I learned so much about myself, it wasn't in a classroom.
No.
It wasn't, you know, hanging out in my living room. It was being outside. Those were so crucial for me developing my personality and developing my skills, and getting to know myself better. And I want that. I want that for my kids. And
Yeah.
I think it's really important that they have that opportunity.
Well, and you mentioned the mental health issues for our society that we've seen definitely skyrocket over the years. And from my background and personal experiences as a child and having a brother that was struggling, one of the reasons I went into education was because I wanted to be able to work with kids who were struggling. And
Hmm.
then when I was in the classrooms, I realized that that's not how I can help as much as I wanted to, because you're within the confines of a system that doesn't really give you the flexibility that you need. And one of the biggest pieces to human happiness is agency. And where else do you I mean, you just don't have agency when you're in a classroom setting or you're in a system that tells you what you're supposed to do and when you're how you're supposed to learn and what you're supposed to learn. And so when the decision came for us to sort of say yes or no to school, originally my mind was like, I want my child to have the ability to have agency over his life. And so
Hmm.
I just was like, let's go for it. Let's see what it looks like as a homeschooling family for a few years, and then we'll go from there. And as you know, we never looked back. Um,
Yeah.
but speaking of the danger side of things and the risk behavior, I cannot think of the name of the article I read recently about that specifically, but I did remember the name of a book that we utilized in one of our co ops when my son was probably about 7 or 8, and it's called The Dangerous Book for Boys. Have you ever heard of that one?
I've seen it. I can picture the cover, but I've never read it. I think there's one for girls too, isn't there?
I was about to say, and I'm pretty sure there's a girl version, but we were able to utilize that book for a group of kids. And the mom who led it was wonderful. And she gave all of them pocket knives, and she gave them all, like, we all got these little toolboxes. And she taught them how to like bandage their arm. So they like joked around and pretended like they had blood on their arm. And then they each had
Hmm.
to bandage each other up. And then they used their pocket knife to like whittle a stick, and then they use like soaps and stuff to learn just the tools. And appreciated that so much because it opened up that freedom to be like, hey, everybody has these tools and now we're going to play with them. And it was not um it wasn't led in a way that was like, you have to do this first and this second and this third. It was more like, I'm going to give you some information about what these things are and how these things work, and let's do it together. And it was a real good experience for him. And on top of that, we were able to even do a survival class with one of the other moms where they went out into the woods, and she had been in the military. So she taught them things like how to find water and how to keep yourself warm in the cold. And those are just wonderful experiences. And I'm so thankful that we got that opportunity. And I think that just continued to reinforce my belief that given kids the space um, and the trust, they will they will surprise you again and again and again with what they can do and what they want to do.
Yes, and if we don't honor that, you have this self-fulfilling prophecy when
Mm-hmm.
you are telling your kids, maybe not in words, but in messages, that by, not giving them that agency, um, they start to believe that they aren't able to do these things.
Yeah.
And this impacts their confidence. This impacts their development. So, it's interesting. There's different cultures and different, where if a 1 year old or a 2 year old goes to grab a knife, they just let their child explore and they kind of just sit back and observe. They don't rush over and grab it from them,
Mm-hmm.
which in standard American parenting is something that would just be, the eyes. I mean, you would get some looks for doing that, and that's not what believe me, I'm not promoting
No.
letting your child play with a knife or anything, but it's just that in different cultures they sort of just let that child play with those things, or explore them, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
and then and let them figure it out, and their children never get hurt. They're playing with these tools that their parents might use, and I'm talking about like hunters and
Sure.
gatherers here. But they would be playing with these tools, and their parents wouldn't take them away from them because they knew that the children eventually needed to
Mm-hmm.
use those in order to
Mm-hmm.
survive. It was a part of their life. And so they would just be curious, and they would allow their child to exercise that curiosity, and kids didn't get hurt.
The libertarian homeschooler, are you familiar with her? She had a
No.
conversation with, she was on a podcast at some point, and I loved what she said about, as parents, we have to get comfortable with our children having some injuries and maybe even an ER visit or two. And it
Yeah.
was funny because to me, I was like, oh gosh, because I didn't want my children to ever have to go to the ER, but we definitely had some injuries in our family. And she, her take was, and appreciated how she worded it, was like, I'm going to give my kids information, but I'm not going to tell them what they should and shouldn't do, unless, of course, they're about to just literally hurt themselves and someone else. That's, you can't come back from it. And again, I think it does go back to the individual families and the cultures that you live within, even within your own family. Like it's even the definition of unschooling. It's like
Mhm.
as much freedom as the parents are comfortably able to handle, right? So I think the same
Right.
thing can be said for like your risk aversion. How risk averse are you? How risk comfortable are you? And then you kind of work within those parameters. But the reality is that if you're constantly telling your kids they can and they can't do something, then they're going to believe it. Like you said, the self-fulfilling prophecy. It makes me think of like hand sanitizing your hands all the time. Like to me, that you're sanitizing their ability to trust themselves if you're constantly
Yep.
telling them what they can and can't do. Um, so to everyone
Yeah.
listening, we're not telling you to let your kids run with knives. We're,
No, no,
we're like,
please do not misconstrue that message. It's just
it's
an example of that other side of it. And I think, and don't get me wrong, I feel like my default is definitely to interject and to make statements to my children at this age. They're
mhm,
7, 4, 1.5, um and just a little side note here, my middle child, he has epilepsy, and so
mm,
that has definitely impacted me on having to be watchful.
sure,
um and so, but I have, I think it's really important to let these kids explore. And so I try to give them as much opportunity to do that. And being outside is just the best way to do it. There's so
it
much
really
for them
is.
to do. And if you can use nature as the backdrop for an education, there is
Mm-hmm.
so much value to that. There's so many things to be learned in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, the opportunities are endless.
They really, really are. And then also changing your scenery, going, if you can, to the beach and the mountains and or some wide open space in the country. Or we feel very fortunate to be where we're located because I can be at the beach in 3 hours. I mean, we've taken day trips to the beach before. It's not our preference, but we've definitely done it. Um, and then the same for the mountains. We're like 2 hours from the mountains. And
Oh, that's
we get
wonderful.
we do. We just like, okay. And even over the pandemic, that was what I committed with the kids. We were like, okay, once a month, we're going to get in the car and we're driving to the mountains for the day. And we did. We got really consistent with that. And so it would be like the first week of the month. We're like, okay, where we're going. And we would take a day and go. And it was my savior for sure. Like I'm so glad we were able to do that because that was back at the beginning too, when everything was really shut down and there was hardly anybody out doing anything. Um, but I was like, nature is our salve. It's super
Oh,
much of a soul lifter.
yep,
Um,
I completely agree with you. We spent a lot of time outside too, and I really thought about kids in schools and or whether they were even doing virtual learning, being stuck inside while they were doing that mostly, um, and kids in classrooms while this is all happening and
mm,
seeing the state of normal completely flipped over on its head. And just thinking what that does to a child's psyche and being so thankful that I could just open my door
mm-hmm.
and we could go outside and there
Yeah.
was no there was no knowledge of coronavirus, of
Mm-hmm.
COVID. There was
Yeah.
there would be nothing to let you know that that was even going on in the world when you stepped
Mm-hmm.
outside. And it makes you think. I was very thankful for that. I thought about people, man, who live in the city and they can't just step outside,
Mm, mm-hmm.
and even parks were closed.
Right, which is crazy, but
Yeah.
because we all know how important it is to breathe fresh air and to be out in nature. And so, yeah, that's kind of a nutsy thing that happened for sure.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about your process, like how with because first of all, your Instagram page and your website and of course your podcast too is just wonderful, and I love the way you write and I love the thoughts that you share. And there was one particular one that actually goes along with what we were talking about. I wanted to bring up what's that image that you have of your son, your second born that you were just talking about. And I just love that picture and I love that caption that you speak about him being your second born and you're so glad he could be wild and free. Um,
Mm.
and so how have you been able to see sort of the evidence and I wouldn't say results, but what does that look like for you over the years? Like the fact that you've been able to allow your children to have that freedom and to be who they are and to come into their own without the confines of a schedule and sort of an external pressures of a system.
Um, I think that my children are confident. Um, and again, I think they know themselves, I mean, pretty well for the ages that they are.
Mhm.
And I know without a doubt that my second born, the one that has epilepsy, I would be getting calls for him left and right because he does not stand still.
Mhm.
He is definitely a risk taker. And I mean, just the idea of him sitting at a desk for any length of time just makes me laugh. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, and he'll sit down and draw forever. He'll sit down and he'll listen to me read for, an hour. But if it doesn't interest him, and of course, when you're in school, you don't have a lot of agency, right?
Mm-mm.
And so I'm sure that I would be called and people would try to prescribe him medicine for, ADD or ADHD.
Mhm.
Um, and having my background in education, and seeing and working with kids and seeing kids who had this, it doesn't always work out very well. And oftentimes it's misdiagnosed, it's overdiagnosed. And really, it's just that kids want to move. They were made to move. And so
Mhm.
I love that my kids, move freely. I know that might sound silly, but they're very comfortable in their bodies, and they are able to climb trees and, um, go explore. And they've developed physically and can do some of the most amazing things because they just have the opportunity to do so. I mean, I see them be
Mhm.
so agile. I see them um, pick up things and I'm like, where did you get that? How do you know how to do that? And it's
Mhm.
just because they're constantly moving. Another thing is that I love that they choose, a lot of times they choose what they want to learn about. So there are some things that obviously I want my children to read. I want my children to understand math. I want them to know that they have to, take baths and brush their
Yeah.
teeth and
The
things like that.
hygiene.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some things that I want them to learn about. And sometimes, they can be a little reluctant, I'm not going to lie. But I also give them time to explore the things that they want to learn about. So you better believe that we have studied dinosaurs and we have
Mhm.
studied spiders. That was our today, what we studied today. But it's so neat to see them take their passions to such a deep level rather than just a surface exploration. So
Mhm.
in classes, or in your typical school classes, you are given the opportunity to really take control of your learning only in these very unique opportunities. And for me, having gone to a public school, those were the things that stand out. I remember being able to pick what I wanted to do for what we called
Mm.
our science fair.
Mhm.
And those were the things that stood out for me because I was able to choose what I wanted to learn about and then do this project on it. But how often is that allowed in a school setting? Not very often at all.
Yeah.
And so my kids spend time researching all the things that they want to learn about, and there's not a time frame on it. I've seen my children are very good drawers, and if they were in a school setting, they would not have time to do that. My children, I mean, they'll spend 2, 3 hours a day drawing, not all in one sitting, but throughout the day, they'll just draw, draw, draw all day long. And the artwork's incredible.
Mhm.
They've been allowed to really develop that and they love doing it. They wouldn't be able to do that if they were in a school.
Mhm.
They'd have little lessons here and there, but it wouldn't be something that they just do when they want. And again, I don't want them to think that they have to fit the mold. I want them to choose a life where they're following their passions.
Sure. Well, and there's something to be said about, again, like you said, that ownership. When you get to choose something, it it opens up a part of your brain that's different than somebody telling you what to do. And I've seen that in my own children's eyes because we have tried very, very hard in our family to give children the space to make decisions for themselves, even if we might not think that they're the best because we're the parent and we've had years of experience and we can kind of foresee what those 2 or 3 steps down the road might look like. But how you can't keep making judgments and decisions for our kids. It's like if your spouse is about to do something, you can just give them information, but they ultimately get to do it and have to make that decision. Um, and I feel
Hmm.
the same way about learning. When our children are zoned in on something and they find something that they love, it's not an inch deep and a mile wide. It's a mile deep, and I feel like I can
Yes.
almost organize my son's life by like the activities that he was interested in from 4 years old up until 12. It was as if we could segment out his life based on, okay, this was the Pokemon era and this was the Lego era and this was the um and my daughter is very similar in that regard. There's certain things that she's honed in on, and she's an incredible artist. Taught herself all the things. um, she taught herself digital art, which I never really even had on my radar. But my son, who's very techie, was super, super into getting us an iPad. I never was like, we don't need an iPad. We're good. We don't, we have computers, we have stuff at home. But he was like, Mom, but this one, this one's really good. And he was like, you have to watch the launch with me. So we sat down and he did all the thing. And I could see the joy in him sharing that with me, even though it wasn't something that I necessarily was interested in. But when I sat and I paid attention and I really got involved, I could see why this was important to him. And so that was the year that he and his sister and I went and actually stood out in front of the Apple store, which is, again, nothing I've ever done before. And we waited till the doors opened and we went and got that iPad. And in my mind, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to use it some and he's going to use it and his sister's going to use it. And within like 2 to 3 months, it was in her room and she was like learning how to draw and she kept playing and playing. And then she was like, can we get this app? It's called Procreate. It is $10. And because, apps are usually like $1. I'm like, what's $10 app? What are you talking about? And she's like, well, but it has all these features. And she showed me a video and I was like, sure, let's just do it. And that has been the app that she has used to create the most beautiful drawings. I am dumbfounded when she shows me stuff that she's worked on. And that's not me. All I did was stand in line at the
Yeah.
Apple store and we were able to thankfully buy one of those this time around. And she has just watched videos and she'll watch people, or she follows people on Instagram who are Procreate artists, um and she just picks up the skills as time is allowed. And the amount of time she's been able to spend on that, I know she would never have gotten to this level. And she's 14, and I'm like, if
Right.
she had to spend all of her hours doing something somebody else demanded of her, when would she have ever really gotten a chance to do these things? And maybe part of this is my redemption because I loved art as a kid and I loved art class
Mm.
and I hated it when they said it's time to go. And I was like, but I'm not finished. And then you'd go back the next week and you were on to something else. And I didn't even get to finish what I was working on. And I remember that in
Right.
middle and not kindergarten, elementary school. I remember thinking, why didn't we get to finish our stuff from last time? Wasn't that important? And it was very
Yes.
frustrating because you learned very early that this is not really as important as the other stuff. So what does that say?
Yeah, and there's a time limit on this and there's a deadline. You
Mhm.
you can draw, but you only have this amount of time and that becomes such a huge constraint. I like being able to give our children the time to
For
finish.
sure.
And if they're working on a project and they need some more time because it's taken them on this different trip than maybe you had intended, so be it,
Yeah. And I think that's a great point to
you
make
know?
too, because sometimes in our heads we have these preconceived notions of what our kids are going to like and what they're going to be drawn to, and then they're not. And it makes us have to pull back and reevaluate what's important and recognize that even if it's not something that we would have picked or we would like or we do like, that does not minimize the importance for them. And by and I'll use Pokemon again as an example because Daniel loved collecting those cards. And I remember thinking, do we really have to buy another pack of Pokemon cards? um, but when you really look at what those cards were doing and what purpose they were serving, it it was teaching. He was learning so much. He was learning math
Mhm.
and science and spelling and reading and memorizing things and organizing his thoughts. And it was unbelievable how much he learned from playing that game. And there were times when I thought to myself, well, I shouldn't buy anymore. And then I remember being like, well, but I wouldn't think twice for buying a book or buying, something that was on my list in my brain of being valuable, quote unquote.
Right.
And I was like, just because it's not in my brain valuable doesn't mean it's not valuable. And I think we have to be careful about that as parents, whether we're homeschooling or not, to remember that if you can take a step back and just observe your children and you see the joy in their face and their eyes, then that is a worthy purchase.
Well, and it's this idea of following their spark,
Mhm.
that's so important. And when you see a spark, follow it, follow it, follow it, give them everything that they need to explore that more. I remember going to the library one day with this intention. I don't even remember what I was like, oh, we're going to learn about this. So I'm going to get a bunch of books on this.
Mhm.
And instead, the kids found a couple books on volcanoes. This was probably 3 years ago now. And so instead of whatever I went there to get that I thought would be great for them to learn, you better believe that the next 2 weeks we spent learning everything
Mhm.
about volcanoes that we could possibly learn about. And I mean, to this day, those kids can tell you more about volcanoes than I ever could.
Oh, isn't it fascinating? Yeah.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, I've learned so much. That's also such a benefit is learning alongside them. And I thought that this might sound so silly, but I thought that any dinosaur that looked like a Tyrannosaurus Rex was a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I
I
never knew there was an Allosaurus and I mean, a Carnotaurus. It might sound really
no,
stupid,
but
but
I'm with
that
you.
was just not on my radar.
Uh-uh.
That was not on my radar before.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I mean, I've laughed about that many, many times over the years of like, oh my gosh, I'm learning so much with you guys. This is so much fun. And I'm like, I do not
Yes.
remember this. And well, and the ideas that are able to be followed when they're given that freedom and the flexibility. And then also the resources that they utilize for information is very different than the resources that I might have used as a child and or even when I was older because they don't see anything as off limits as something to learn from, right? They don't it's
Yeah.
not it doesn't have to just come
Yes.
from a book. It doesn't have to just come from a magazine. It can come from your friend, the TV, the podcast, the YouTube channel. And so they see it from such a larger perspective than we do. And or we have a tendency to sometimes. Um, if you don't mind, would you mind just kind of giving us a little bit of insight about your podcast and parenting and sort of the peaceful parenting side of things and maybe what that looks like day to day for you or for your family?
Yeah, sure. So this kind of ties back to what we were talking about before with um, looking at the status quo and asking why is that the status quo and questioning it. Um, so I went to school to be an educator and I took all these classes that really focused on a child's behavior. And I was not raised in a house where, punishments were used or rewards were used, but I took these classes that were so focused on behavior and trying to
Mm,
manipulate a child into doing certain things to get this desired behavior. And and I've always loved working with kids, always. Their minds have always made me just so delighted because of the pureness of a
mm-hmm.
child. And so I always knew that I wanted to work with kids. And became a mom, I just started researching it more because and as my podcast and as my website and my Instagram kind of talk about, I don't think that we should just wing it. We have this idea in our society that, oh, parenting, it's just, by the seat of our
Mm,
pants, we just wing it. And you hear that a lot. And I understand the spirit of that message. And of course, there's some elements of truth to that because there's no manual, there's not necessary, you can't plan for everything that might come up. But just like anything else in your life, if you do some research and actually look into things more, you're going to be more informed and you'll be able to make better decisions on it. And so I started looking into peaceful parenting. I can't tell you how I did, I don't remember why, but I started, it's sort of, I had to unlearn some of the things that I learned in my education classes and go back to my roots, which is, the name of my podcast, Mama's Roots Are
mm-hmm.
Showing, which has multiple meanings. Um, because even though I didn't experience this looking at behavior as something to conquer in my own childhood, I was conditioned in the classes that I took to use, rewards and sticker charts and timeouts and those things. So, um, having done all the research on this, now I know that those things don't work. And not only that, but they're detrimental to the child, to the parent, and to then, of
For
course, to the
sure.
parent child relationship. And so, yeah, I'm a big researcher. I love, if there's something that I love, I will never stop researching it. And parenting is one of those things. And so I'm constantly reading books on parenting and, of course, on education. Um, and they have served me so well. And I wanted to share that information with other people who maybe don't have the time or don't have the desire to
Mm-hmm.
sit there and read through all this literature and all these studies on it. It's fascinating to me, but I'm able to deconstruct it
Yeah.
and then put it out there into the world in practical advice. And so that is my aim because I don't want moms to lose themselves in motherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of that happens in our society, but it doesn't have to be that
It does
way.
not.
And there are no, and there are ways. It should be a joyful thing. Not that there aren't challenging moments and challenging days, but you should you should embrace motherhood and love it. And there's ways to do that. Unfortunately, a lot of the standard American parenting um, prevents that from
Mm-hmm.
happening. It doesn't encourage you to enjoy it. It puts you up against your child rather than
Sure.
becoming their their partner in this journey.
And their advocate. Yeah. And like you were saying too, with some of the tactics that were used, like in the classroom, it's to modify their behavior to fit that classroom setting, which is artificial. And so
Mm-hmm.
you get children behaving, but it's fake behavior. It's I'm going to do it just so I can avoid a punishment or not have a privilege taken away from me. And who wants to have that kind of relationship? That's completely inauthentic. And we're actually asking our children to not be themselves, but you're making my life easier. We don't mind that you're not being yourself, right? I mean, that's kind of the message that they get when we're asking them to jump through all these hoops to do things that fit the agenda of the adults. And it, I will say, because I love peaceful parenting and it's something I'm 1,000,000% on board with and researched also, as just as you have. And um, what has for sure stuck out for me and has continued to prove the point, if you will, is that it helps our kids be able to really speak for themselves, because when we hear their little voices, they want to tell us things when their voices get older. And this idea of teenage years and the terrible teenage years, I we don't have that here. Like that's not an experience
Mm-hmm.
of ours, because my children don't know. They know that they don't have to fight me. They know they don't have to fight their families to get to be heard and to be understood and appreciated. And so I will say, I'll just put a plug in for anybody who has or is curious about peaceful parenting, what that looks like. It's not about not having difficult times or challenges or even confrontation. It's about how you handle the confrontation and the challenges and recognize that it's just part of interacting with other humans. It's going to happen, but you have a choice. Do you look at each other and say, okay, we're having a difficult time right now, let's figure this out? Or do you try to power over them and control them? And when you take the latter, or when you try to do connection versus control,
Mm-hmm.
then you are developing a relationship that is something that will last and be more powerful and also more authentic for years and years to come.
Yeah, and it's about keeping that those long-term goals in mind. You know, it's not you can
Mm-hmm.
easily get your children to comply with you. You can threaten them, you could yell at them, you can put fear
Mm-hmm.
into them, you can threaten to take something away. Um, and that might work in the immediate that moment, but it's doing some long-term damage. And like you said, it's connection over everything,
Mm-hmm.
and building the relationship with your kids and not putting them on the other side and you on this side where you're against each other during a challenge. It's working together to come up with a solution. It's all about the relationship and finding ways, of course, to model um, how you regulate your own emotions, because we all
Mm-hmm.
are
That's super important.
imperfect. It
Yeah.
is, and understanding our own triggers. We all have triggers. We all have um, things that upset us, and we have to regulate our own emotions. So it's really being mindful and understanding that part of ourselves and not just reacting, but
Yeah.
rather responding to what is happening. So I think that's a key point too. And yeah, seeing your children as being full beings, even as little babies, instead of oftentimes with infant care, you hear people say, "Oh, well, they're just a little blob right now." And I'm like, "Well, I it's strange, that you see them that way, and you can still connect with them."
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I know Magda Gerber, who developed the rye parenting
Yes.
method, which is beautiful,
Yes.
she says, and this is just me off the cuff here, so I'm sure I'm not quoting it correctly, but she says, you want to really picture, your infant, your baby, and even a small child as almost an elderly person that you're taking
Mm.
care of. And
Mhm.
so you let them know that you're going to be putting their shirt on right now. You let them
Mhm.
know that you're going to lay them down while you bathe them or whatever. And so it's respecting the child as a full being from the minute that they're born.
Mm. Yeah.
They're a child right now, they're a person right now. It's not just molding them into something that's the goal. It's to enjoy them right now, but to honor that they're a human and they have preferences, they have feelings, and also I always think that it's a good idea to ask yourself, how would I respond if this was an adult doing this? There's oh, well, your child, they left their favorite toy at the restaurant and you've been telling them that they need to be careful and remember that. Well, would you yell at a friend if they did that?
Mhm. Too bad. That's what you
No.
get for not paying attention or not keeping up with your stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, you would
Right.
not.
You would never say that.
Mm-mm.
Right.
No.
Or if a child was whining to you about something, there's this trigger, whining is a trigger. Well, um, we whine to each other all the time.
Mhm. Mhm.
Adults do. And whining is a way for your child to communicate. I think at the end of the day, what we want, and you mentioned this when you were talking about how things in your own home are with your relationship with your kids, we want our children to run
Mhm.
to us when they have a problem, not away from us.
Absolutely. Yep.
And when they trust you, when you respect them, and that's a mutual thing, when there is a connection and a true relationship there, that
Mhm.
just naturally happens.
For sure. Yes. Oh my goodness. And you were talking about the babies. There's the idea of the fourth trimester, which
Oh,
I
yes.
would love for that to become a bit more common knowledge that, it's just because the baby is now outside of your body does not mean that the baby needs they still need that same like womb like care that they were getting inside your
Yes.
body, but for those next 3 months especially. But then of course I feel that it goes even further than that. But it's very intense time after they're born to keep them close and to make them feel like the world is safe and that their needs are met, because that's creating their structure in their own mind that it's a question I believe that our beings are trying to answer. The world is safe or the world is not. And even though they can't think logically like you can, as you get older, their body's responding to the world. So they're taking in information on this physiological level that will impact their abilities and their thoughts and their behavior moving forward.
Oh, yes. There's so much research on that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. How um, children or babies, we think that, well, how they won't remember
Mm-hmm.
this. Well, they might not have a memory
Yeah.
of it, but their body,
Yes.
the brain development does. And so, this is why there's different methods that are common in parenting. Um, that need to be looked at, and like the cry it out method or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, that changes the
Yeah.
baby's brain. And these are things that we need to be really well aware of, and this is why research is a really important thing. And if it's not something, that there's so much information out there, that's the thing, that it can be truly overwhelming. And a lot of times, if it's not even on your radar, we sort of inherit the way that we were
Mm-hmm.
raised, and we just move forward, and that's how
Yeah.
we parent. Okay, well, my mom did this, my dad did this, so I'm going to do that. And sometimes that works out great, but I think it would benefit us all to look at that a little bit more and say, well, are there some things that I can change, that I should maybe
Mm-hmm.
improve on, or some things that they did great, that I can trudge forward with? But it does take some reflection. We shouldn't just wing motherhood. We get to do it once, and our children only get one
Mm-hmm.
childhood. And it's so crucial for the development and how they end up in adulthood for the rest of their lives. They get to do this once, and we get to do it once. So let's not just wing it. Let's be mindful and intentional.
I love that. Mm-hmm. And I do believe so strongly in the ideas of bringing into your consciousness the patterns and behaviors and attitudes that you brought to your parenting. Because if you don't, then they will repeat, and almost automatically. It's like as if you don't even have control over it. And you were talking about the whining. I think that's a trigger for some people, because that could have been something that they were not that they experienced as children. When they were whining, somebody snipped at them or got really upset with them and didn't get down on their level and look in their eyes and hold their hands and say, what is it that you're trying to get from me? Or what is it that you need? Or I hear that you're not feeling well. And having that connection and that compassionate caretaking, which if you didn't get that as a child and you never dealt with it or you never understood it, and then you become a parent, it's easy for that particular behavior to just trigger you so quickly, because you didn't receive the care that you needed then. So you're not really equipped to offer that care now,
Oh,
unless
yes.
you take the time to really look at it.
Yeah, and that can take a lot of work to do. Unpacking our triggers, they can be
Mm-hmm.
so transformative, and it's really crucial that we do that if we really want to understand ourselves, but also, like you said, maybe break some cycles, some patterns in our families and in our upbringing. But it is well worth the work, but it can be very challenging because
It can be.
sometimes we don't even realize that.
Which is why these conversations are so important. And it's also why our community, creating that community, is so vital, particularly if you're trying to break patterns and you recognize that you don't want to repeat the things that happened to you or that you saw in your own childhood. It's, there's plenty of people out there and plenty of resources available to help you kind of walk away from a certain way of handling things into something that's a bit more connecting and beneficial for you and your family.
Yeah, and it's okay to make mistakes, Generally
Oh, yeah.
speaking, it's okay to make mistakes. I mean, I've apologized to my kids. I've had to do that on numerous occasions, and I'm going to do it again.
Yeah.
So perfection isn't something that we need to even aspire to.
No,
it's simply
not at all.
yeah, it's not that. It's growth, and it is
Mhm.
awareness. When we know better, we do better.
For
And
sure.
the only way to know more is to, listen to podcasts. It's to read
No.
books, right? It is. So we gain so much knowledge, and that helps us on our journey so much.
It truly, truly does. So, you have been so gracious and offered so much time to me today, and I appreciate it. Are there any parting words or words of encouragement or advice that you might want to offer to some parents with little ones out there?
I think that just to circle back, the whole thing with parenting, the secret sauce, the secret ingredient to parenting is our connection to our children.
Mhm.
And when you can find those pockets of time or those moments to create connection, that is going to build exponentially. So find those ways to connect, whether it's reading together, whether it's having a date night together. It can just be getting down on your child's level and looking in their eyes, asking for a hug. Um, One of the things I love to do is we have a secret handshake, to do a secret
Mm.
handshake with your kids. So there's so many ways to do it that can fit your family culture, whatever
Mhm.
that looks like. But spend some time looking at that and looking at your child and understanding what their needs are and connecting with them, because that's what's going to make all of the problems that come from parenting oftentimes are from a lack of connection, misbehavior, or when the relationship is suffering, it usually stems from a
Mhm.
lack of connection. So when you get that part down, that makes such a huge difference in the whole journey itself. So always go
Yeah.
back to that. If you're finding yourself struggling or you're finding a child struggling, ask yourself that question. When was the last time we really connected? Do we need to connect more here? And the answer is probably yes.
And the answer is probably yes, 100%. I completely agree with Nicolette's insight here. Connection is how we build on and enhance our relationships with one another. And our children definitely benefit when we are intentional and mindful of this. I'm reminded of the book Hold On to Your Kids: Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers, written by Dr. Gordon Neufeld and Dr. Gabor Mate.
in which they discuss, among many other things, the need for parents to, quote, collect their kids, end quote. By collecting our children, we tap into a biological imperative of humans, which is to be seen and heard. They also suggest that we as parents focus on the long-term objective of a nurturing relationship, and this happens through connection. Speaking of, I included all the ways you can connect with Nicolette in the show notes, and don't forget to join me over on Instagram where I spend most of my time these days. As always, stay curious, stay connected, and stay aware. Until next time.